Hi, thank you so much, Rob, and thanks. Wonderful to see everybody here today. Awesome. And so we're going to be spending the next 4 weeks reading some Jātaka stories, just a few Jātaka stories, and having a little bit of discussion about it. And it's a bit of a different thing for me. Normally, I teach based on the suttas or meditation or something, but I did a little bit of work on Jātakas last year, and I wanted to sort of share some of the things that I've been finding and looking at. So hopefully we can explore that a bit today. Great to see people here joining from different places around the world, some familiar faces. Okay, so let's talk about the Jātakas. Now, a brief bit of background. I'm not going to spend too much time in the background. I did give recommended reading from Rhys Davids' book in Buddhist India, and I'm hoping that you all read that. I'm looking around for the guilty faces now to see who's read it and who hasn't read it. But hopefully you've read that. And if everything that I'm saying today does not make sense, then go back and read it, and it'll make better sense next time. Okay, I don't want to go back over work that was mostly covered well by Rhys Davids in that pioneering article. I mean, a few things in that article are a little bit outdated, but mostly it's still a really interesting. The reason I recommended that was because it's an interesting historical document as well, just like of noting the way that understanding of the Jātakas was transmitted in modern times. Okay, so the Jātakas, very briefly, are life stories of the Buddha, past life stories of the Buddha. We find a few Jātaka stories in that sense in the early suttas, but not that many. And when the Buddha gave his ninefold collection of the different categories of the teaching, the Jātakas were one of those 9 categories. So they've been there for a long time. But the collection, what we're going to be talking about today, is not exactly the same as that. What we're talking about today is the collection known as the Jātakas, the Jataka book, which is a specific part of the Pali Canon, which is one of the books in the Khuddaka Nikaya, or the minor collection. Now, there are 500 something stories in that Jataka collection in Pali. Of course, there are many other Jātakas in other Buddhist traditions as well, many in Tibetan, many in Chinese, as well as others that were added in later collections within the Pali or the Theravada tradition. I don't know if anybody's really counted all of them, but there's probably 1,000 or so Jātakas altogether. But the main collection is the Pali Jataka collection. This has been a cornerstone of Buddhist education, certainly within the Theravada world, and the kind of most common way, or one of the most common ways, that Buddhism is transmitted, especially to kids. You have your Sunday school or your classes in the temples, and they will read Jātaka stories. And these are stories that basically in Theravada countries, everyone grew up knowing, a bit like, the Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast or something like that. They have this kind of mythic quality because they are stories that you never really hear for the first time. They're just sort of part of the culture, and you've heard them growing up, and so you've understood them at different levels or in different ways. I should add, not all of the Jātakas are like that. Some of them are, but the Jātaka collection itself is very diverse, and many of the stories are quite adult orientated. In fact, some of them were translated into Latin when they were first published and translated in the West, because the translators thought that they were unfit for children. So they were put into Latin, so that if anyone was trying to sneak through the library and see the naughty bits in the Jātakas, then that would keep them out of harm's way. So not all of them are kiddie stories. Some of them are actually, especially towards the end of the collection, are quite long and quite sophisticated, and almost start to approach a novel-like format in the literary complexity, depth of characterization, and so on. So for this course, I have selected a few Jātakas semi-randomly, trying to illustrate a few of the main points of the collection, so hopefully can give a bit of an introduction for people and an illustration of some of the interesting things that we might find there. One of the reasons why I'm doing this is because last year I sort of set aside my main work with the four Nikayas for a few months and diverted myself with making some translations of Jātaka verses. And I found this was a very interesting project, and I would like to complete it. Actually, I'd like to translate all the verses, but I've just translated a few so far. And normally in the Jātakas we have, let me just give briefly the main parts of a Jātaka story. Again, Rhys Davids goes into more detail with this, but very generally you have four main parts, okay? The introduction, which gives you an event in the Buddha's day. So this is called the present story, the present being in the life of the Buddha. Then you have the Jataka story itself, which is the story of past lives. And that Jataka story has two parts, a prose part and a verse part, right? And then you have the ending part, which gives you the identification of who in this part was the characters in this part. So the characters in these two parts are then identified with each other. And there's various other like commentarial, analytical material as well. But these are the main parts of the Jataka story. So of all of these parts, only the verses are canonical. So the Pali Canon includes a collection of poetry, which it calls the Jataka collection. There are a few prose passages in there, but basically it's just a poetry collection. And then all of this other is sort of added from the commentaries, all right? So this, of course, raises the question of like, what's the relationship between all of these different parts? I mean, this is a vast collection of literature, and clearly it wasn't just, it wasn't like somebody just sat down and wrote it or composed it or something like that. It evolved over a long period of time. Generally speaking, the understanding is that the stories are perhaps the oldest portion. The verses are often subsequent to the story or tangential to the story. Like they kind of go together, but the verses often sum up the main gist of the story. And the cladding is, of course, added later in the commentarial period. And so what the cladding does is it provided the Buddhist community with a means of adopting stories into its tradition. And I want to just briefly dwell on that point. For myself and for many of the people here, a main focus of study of Dhamma is through the suttas. And one of the interesting and almost slightly curious dimensions of the suttas is that there's not that many stories in them. I mean, I don't know if you kind of noticed. I mean, there are a few. There's a few stories of people in the life of the Buddha, like Ratapala or Angulimala and so on. And there's a few like short parables and so on. But there's not that many kind of extended narratives in the sutta collections themselves. There are some, but not that many. I was kind of curious. The Jātakas very much filled that gap. And so they were used from quite an early date for conveying the principles of the Dhamma, especially conveying the basic ethical teachings of the Dhamma. And so this is usually how the Jātakas are perceived, as being like moral fables that are there to illustrate a lesson. But one of the things I want to try to convey in this course is that there is in fact a lot more to it than that. And stories are very rich and multifaceted and many-layered. And we can find actually a lot of very interesting and very diverse materials within the Jātakas. And these are all, to my mind, these are all interesting because they tell us something interesting in themselves, purely as literature and as spiritual teachings and so on. But they're also interesting because they tell us something about the Buddhist community who adopted these things. Why did Buddhists in the past want to put these stories in their collection? Why did they adapt them in this way? Like what was actually going on that would make this necessary or interesting and so on? We'll see some examples of that in the story that we're going to be looking at today. So these are some of the very brief background of the Jātakas. Now, so sorry, yes, the links that I sent around earlier got changed actually. So I think Ananda Jyoti changed the URL scheme on his site or something. So I apologize for that. Yeah, I think Rob said he sent the updated ones around in the emails, but I can put them in here as well. Anyway, also if somebody can put the new ones in the chat, that would be great. Okay, so we're going to be looking today at Jātaka number 1. At start at the beginning, a very good place to start. And this is called the Aparnaka Jataka, usually translated as the unquestionable Jataka or something like that. No. So that's even when we come to the title, we've already got, even though it's the unproblematic Jataka, but no, trust, if you know Sujato and his teachings, you know that no, that definitely is problematic. And so we're going to be talking about that, and we're going to be looking at the Jataka. I'm going to pop in here very briefly the actual Jataka verse, make sure that we're all on the same page. So this is the verse of the Jataka. This is the part that I've translated. All right. And I'm going to put that in there. Hang on. That says to Pat Howe. I don't want to send to Pat Howe. I want to send to everyone. Meeting group chat. Okay. Okay. So there is the, that's my translation of the Jataka verse. And let me just briefly read that out for you. When some have an unfailing basis, while sophists speak of a second way, an intelligent person knowing this would take up what is unfailing. All right. Very simple little verse. Okay. You can hear it's a kind of a moral kind of verse there. It's not entirely clear exactly like what it's going on about. So one of the things that that Rhys Davids pointed out was that the verses are very often quite incomprehensible without the stories. And so it's not what you might imagine. Like if you think of the Jātakas as being like moral fables, then what you might imagine is that the verses are going to give like the lesson of the story, encapsulate the lesson of the story, which is illustrated, which sometimes happen. And in this case, yes, we can see that that's happened in some way. Like there's moral being conveyed here. But the actual context and meaning and purpose of it is not really that clear. And in many cases, the verses are quite obscure and the meaning of them is very difficult to figure out without the story. And this is one of the things that interested me about this. The Jataka verses are much more difficult and much more interesting than the other late Buddhist verses. If you look at the late canonical Buddhist literature, there's the things like the Buddha Vamsa, Charya Pitaka, Vimanawatu, Petawatu, Terapadana, Teripadana, and so on. These are generally speaking, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but these are generally speaking very boring. And the verse structures are boring, the rhetoric is boring, the language is boring. These are very boring for a translator to try to translate. They're not really inspired literary works. They're very kind of didactic and very kind of plainly featured verses. Jātakas are not like that at all. They're completely different. And they are wild and they're full of experimentation and oddities. And you can see that they have that kind of playful, gnarly, obscure flavor that you get from like folk verses, playing with language, subverting expectations and so on. And so this is why I find the Jātakas very interesting. Now, as Rhys Davids pointed out, that the prose often is necessary in order to make sense of the verse, like they are read together, right? So the story of the past and the verses of the past are read together. But what I've found in doing my translation is that needs to be taken carefully, because the prose and the verse don't always agree. And so past translators have almost always translated the prose so as to be in line with the verse, right? So you're making the prose and the verse match up. And if you read those older translations, that's what happens. Whereas when I'm looking at trying to translate the verses in and of themselves, that's not necessarily the case. Actually, the verses sometimes seem to be a bit different to the prose, sometimes quite different. And so you can see there's a kind of a loose relationship between the prose and the verse. Verses may have started independently, being put there as a moral or something like that. In some cases, they might be prose and then verses are attached to it, but then the prose might be developed and expanded. Remember that the prose is in the commentary, so it's many hundreds of years later. So it could well have been that there was a prose and a verse that matched up, and then the prose was developed and they never really changed the verse to match, and so on. So we can't really understand this process until we've looked more closely at the verses to try to figure out exactly what they're saying. So let me go briefly through the language in this verse, and then we'll have a look at the story. All right. Okay, so now, where are we? Okay, good. Okay, so the first thing about the title, Apannaka Jātaka. So this is something that actually came out of my research in the suttas, and the word Apannaka appears also in the suttas, and it has it's a tricky word etymologically and linguistically. Most of the times, if you look at different translators, they'll have a footnote on this and they'll say, well, we don't exactly understand what Apannaka is about. And I think the reason for that, I only myself realized it doing some research a couple of years ago now. And I learned from the translation of the Rig Veda by Brereton and Jamieson, and which is a fantastic piece of work. And one of the things that they pointed out there was about the ancient Indian game of dice. Okay, so I'm going to now talk to you a little bit about how to play dice in ancient India. All right, now when we think of dice, we think of like a small little cube with dots on either side with numbers that add up to 7, and you roll it, and then you get one chance in 6 of getting it. That's what we think when you think of a dice, right? I was kind of shocked, to be honest, when I was in England recently, and we went to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and they had an exhibition from the Indus Valley civilization, and they actually have a dice exactly like that. I wish I could have the photo here to share it with you. But it's astonishing. It's like literally exactly the same as a modern dice, like the numbers add up to 7 on opposite sides, like the numbers are arranged in the same way, 2 sets of 3 dots and 5 with 1 dot and so on. Literally exactly the same as a modern dice from 3,000 years ago in India. So I was kind of blown away by that. So that tells you one thing: people really like to gamble. They really like games of chance. Life isn't fun enough, so we've got to try to gamble. And if you look in ancient Indian storytelling, gambling is a huge thing. It's a major plot point in the Mahabharata. The king gambles his whole kingdom away, and many stories where this features. In fact, one of the other Jātaka stories will also feature gambling. Personally, I don't really get it. I always found gambling to be very boring. I never really had anything to gamble away, but even when I did, I didn't gamble. At one time when I was a kid, we went to the casino. I was just like 18. My mum gave me, I was probably less than 18, but anyway, my mum gave me some, $10 or $20 or something like that. This is back in the 80s, a long time ago, right? To go to the casino just with my friends, and I played like a game of like the poker machine or something like that, and I just lost my money. And I thought, why am I giving my money away to these people? I'll buy some beer instead. So that was my gambling career. I thought alcohol was a much better investment. At least you got something back from it. Anyway, so I'm not really a gambler myself, but mistaking the importance that it has for the Indian tradition. Now, I mentioned that the dice, six-sided dice, is found in the Indus Valley civilization, but in the Vedic tradition, the dice game was different. And what we call dice, what we call a dice game, involved, and this is the result of many years of research, which Brereton and Jamieson talked about. So what you do is you make a hollow or a bowl, right, a dish, and then you fill that with the Jātaka seed, a particular kind of seed. Then the two players will each grab a handful of seeds. And that's the actual play, is you grab a handful of seeds. Then you have to count how many seeds that you've grabbed. All right. And if the amount of seeds you've got is divisible by 4, then that's a winning hand. Okay, so you find this, the imagery is through the suttas quite a number of times, and I've never particularly understood it, but this is why it's called a kati gaha, right? Is a kati, or kata gaha is a perfect hand, because the gaha is a handful. So kata gaha is 4, but if you don't have the 4, right, you have a kali gaha, which is a losing hand. All right, and so this is used as a term for like bad luck or something like that. But the worst kind of hand you can have, right, is a hand that has 5 seeds in it, because you have to get 4, right? So if you've got one that's 5, then you're worse, right? So what apannaka means literally is a set without a fifth, right? So it means you've got your hand and you've got exactly 4, exactly a divisible by 4 in the hand. So apannaka is a set without a fifth. So that means you've got a winning hand and you can't fail. Yeah. So when you see the translations, like the older translations were translated something like unquestionable. So this is assuming that pannaka comes from the Pali word panha, meaning question or problem, which is a kind of a supposition that people made, but it's not really true. I've never really liked that translation, because why should the Buddha's teaching be unquestionable? The Buddha actually told us we should question it all the time. So that was why I was always kind of a bit uncertain about that translation. I didn't quite understand why it should be unquestionable. So that's the meaning, is that unfailing is a winning hand. So basically like a royal flush or something like that you've got. So that's the meaning of the title, the unfailing, okay? So some have an unfailing basis. In other words, some have a winning hand. Sophists speak of a second way, right? Do something else. So the word I've translated as sophist here is a takkika, right? Takkika. So one who takkis, one who thinks, one who rationalizes. An intelligent person knowing this would take up what is unfailing. So this is a kind of a bit of advice about who to listen to. But of course, it's not telling you particularly any context, right? I mean, that's a very generic verse, right? You get different advice. Some of it's reliable, some of it's not reliable. You should rely on those whose advice is reliable. So that's a nice little moral verse, but it doesn't actually really tell you anything about the context. So you could imagine that verse could easily be attached to any number of different stories, right? It's not particularly linked to this particular story. Now, the prose story that it is attached to, I'll go on to that prose story in just a minute. But before going on to that prose story, it's worth noting that this particular verse, or the story, not the verse, the story has a precedent in the suttas. And I'm going to pop that in the chat right now. So that sutta I'm giving now is there we go. Oh, who put that dice in there? That's fantastic. Yeah. So that's from the, I'm not sure if that looks like it's in the ground there, but I saw it in the Ashmolean. Yeah, that's a different one, actually. The one in the Ashmolean, but it's the same principle. Yeah, it's a different physical object. Anyway, worth checking out if you're in Oxford. Okay. So I've just popped in there the text for Digha Nikaya number 23, the Payasi Sutta. And this gives a canonical telling of the story which the prose portion of the Jātaka is based on. Okay, so this is one of the fairly small number of instances where the Jataka prose story is actually based on a sutta story. Now, the sutta story is Payasi Sutta, told by the monk Kumara Kassapa to Prince Payasi. Fantastic sutta, lots of great stories in there, but unfortunately we can't go into that in too much detail. But we get a version of the prose narrative of the Jataka, which is shorter and simpler and obviously earlier than the prose narrative we find in the Jataka book, in the commentary. And I'll just read through that story for you right now before we get onto the Jataka itself. So this is from Digha Nikaya number 23. Once upon a time, a large caravan of 1,000 wagons traveled from a country in the east to the west. Wherever they went, they quickly used up the grass, wood, water, and green foliage. Now, that caravan had 2 leaders, each in charge of 500 wagons. They thought, this is a large caravan of 1,000 wagons. Wherever we go, we quickly use up the grass, wood, water, and the green foliage. Why don't we split the caravan in 2 halves? So that's what they did. One caravan leader, having prepared much grass, wood, and water, started the caravan. After 2 or 3 days' journey, he saw a dark man with red eyes coming the other way in a donkey cart with muddy wheels. He was armored with a quiver and wreathed with a yellow lotus, his clothes and hair all wet. Seeing him, he said, "Sir, where do you come from?" "From such and such a country." "Well, where are you going?" "To the country named so-and-so." "But has there been much rain in the desert up ahead?" "Indeed there has, sir. The paths are sprinkled with water, and there is much grass, wood, and water. Toss out your grass, wood, and water. Your wagons will move swiftly when lightly laden. So don't tire your draft teams." So the caravan leader addressed his drivers. "This man says that there's been much rain in the desert up ahead. He advises us to toss out our grass, wood, and water. So let's toss it out." "Yes, worthy sir," the drivers replied, and that's what they did. But in the caravan's first campsite, they saw no grass, wood, or water. And in the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and seventh campsites, they saw no grass, wood, or water, and all fell to ruin and disaster. And the men and the beasts in that caravan were all devoured by that non-human spirit. Only their bones remained. Now, when the second caravan leader knew that the first caravan was well underway, he prepared much grass, wood, and water and started the caravan. After 2 or 3 days' journey, he saw a dark man with red eyes coming the other way in a donkey cart with muddy wheels, armored with a quiver and wreathed with yellow lotus, his clothes and hair all wet. Seeing him, he said, "Sir, where do you come from?" "From such and such a country." "Where are you going?" "To the country named so-and-so." "But has there been much rain in the desert up ahead?" "Indeed there has, sir. The paths are sprinkled with water, and there is much grass, wood, and water. Toss out your grass, wood, and water. Your wagons will move swiftly when lightly laden." The caravan leader addressed his drivers. "This man said there's been much rain in the desert up ahead, and we should toss out our grass, wood, and water. But this person is neither our friend nor relative. How can we proceed out of trust in him? We should not toss out any grass, wood, or water, but continue with our goods laden as before. We shall not toss out any old stock." "Yes, worthy sir," the drivers replied, and they restarted the caravan with the goods laden as before. And in the caravan's first campsite, they saw no grass, wood, or water. And the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh campsites, they saw no grass, wood, or water. And they saw that the other caravan had come to ruin, and they saw the bones of the men and beasts who had been devoured by that non-human spirit. So the caravan leader addressed his drivers. "This caravan came to ruin, as happens when guided by a foolish caravan leader. Well then, sirs, toss out any of our merchandise that's of little value and take what's valuable from this caravan." "Yes, worthy sir," replied the drivers, and that's what they did. They crossed over the desert safely, as happens when guided by an astute caravan leader. So this is the parable as found in the suttas, and the story is found in the Jātakas, follows much the same outline. We'll come to that in just a minute. Pretty much the same story, some more elaboration on some details. But I just want to make a few remarks about this sutta story before we begin. Now, I mentioned before, this is part of the Payasi Sutta, taught by Kumara Kassapa, probably a somewhat late sutta. So we're talking probably maybe, I don't know, maybe 50, 100 something years after the Buddha. Now, a few details which I think are relevant for this period. Number one, you can see the importance of international trade. All right, fundamental. And this, in fact, is opening up the entire Jataka collection. Right? And it's not just this particular sutta, but many of the Jātakas in the first chapter are all dealing with international trade. Okay, and so this is specifically a concern for the years, some years after the Buddha. So within the Buddha's time, they mostly traded in the Ganges Delta, and only from about 100 years or so after that, then Alexander arrives from the west, and the trade routes to Sri Lanka were opening up, ocean routes opening up to the east and to the west. And so international trade becomes a big deal. And a lot of the Jataka stories reflect that. And this, of course, then also reflects the manner in which Buddhism was transmitted through these areas. All right. So this is a kind of a meta narrative, not just of this particular caravan traveling, but of the stories that are traveling. Because, of course, whenever people would travel, stories would travel too. And this is how Buddhism spread across the world, from going from one place to another by trade routes. And notice how when they get to the other country, they don't pay any tariffs. And so I'm not sure. Like in the Artha Shastra, which comes from a rougher period, there are actual tariffs and so on mentioned, but it seems mostly that they were trading and the tariffs were at least moderate or something like that. But anyway, we're now a few days after May the 4th. And so everyone knows that's the Star Wars Day, and May the 4th be with you. But if there is one lesson that I've learned from Star Wars, it is this, that trade disputes never lead to the rising of evil empires. Oh, hang on, sorry, no. It's that trade disputes can lead to the rising of evil empires. Sorry, that's a lesson I learned from Star Wars. So hopefully that is not, hopefully that's as truthful as the rest of Star Wars. Anyway, moving along. Okay, moving along. So stories follow trade routes, and the Buddhist monastics, the Sangha, were also following those same trade routes. So this is how these stories were moving. And of course, it's a two-way flow, things flowing into India and back and forth, and everybody telling everybody else's stories. So this is the first thing which I think is interesting about this. Now, one thing it doesn't tell us is where this takes place. The Jātaka story itself gives us the extra detail that they were setting out from Benares. And so it was one of the major cities at that time. So that's reasonable, but it doesn't tell us where they were setting out to. And I'm going to make a little proposal here. I'm going to try to do a screen share. So hopefully this will work. So this is where our story begins. I'll give a terrain map. Yep, good. So Varanasi. So here, hopefully you can see in the middle of the screen is Varanasi. That's where we begin. And mostly the Buddha lived in this area. So he lived around Varanasi, Bihar, up to far Lucknow and Uttar Pradesh, as far northwest as New Delhi, roughly, and as far east, close to the border of Bangladesh. And you can see the mountainous area down below. This is the Deccan. So the Buddha didn't go further south than that. Now, the whole story that we're talking here about the trade route is talking about getting lost in the desert and the dangers posed by the deserts. And as you can see, the area around Varanasi is actually very fertile, floodplains, and it's not a desert region at all. So when this story is being set, it's not being set about trade through this region. The overwhelmingly in India, of course, the main desert region is to the west in Rajasthan and the Thar Desert over here. And so what I propose is that this story is in fact a story about travel, extension of the travel realms to this desert in the far west of India. I'm now going to just zoom in briefly. So you can see even today that a lot of this area is still very much desert. So you can see even at that high resolution, hopefully you can see that there's no farms or anything like that. There's often just nomadic communities and very arid and challenging desert conditions. So you can see that making trade across that area would have been hard, as indeed it still is today. And I'm just going to, while I have Google Maps here, I'm just going to point out one other detail that we find in the Jātaka stories, that it talks about seeing a line of trees from the desert. So you're crossing over the desert and you see, oh, the desert's going to end because there's a line of trees there. And I was kind of struck by that, because if you're in the desert in Australia, and I think most deserts in the US is probably similar, that doesn't really happen. I mean, you have deserts and it's scrub, and then, you know, maybe there's a few more trees and a few more other trees and so on. But you don't get like a really clear delineation that you have now reached the end of the desert by seeing a line of trees. But of course, as you see here from Rajasthan, that in fact is exactly what happens, that there's a sudden shift from the desert region to the forested regions. So coming across that must have been this huge sense of relief when you come over to the west and to the fertile lands there again. And so that was then you're back to safety and you can sell your goods, make some money. So that's just a little bit of background on the geography of that situation. I'm going to stop the screen sharing now. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing. So this is a little background on the geography of that situation. And I'd like to have a look at that, because to me, it's important to ground these stories in the physical reality and the lived reality, like what were these people actually doing. Okay, so there's a few other details about the caravan. First of all, there's a lot of them. 500 carts is a big deal. It's a big caravan. It was clearly like it's clearly like meant. Now in this sutta, notice that in the sutta it says that they guided them across the desert safely. All right, I'm going to come back to that, because the outcome in the Jataka is a bit different. But another detail, of course, is the detail of the yaka who they meet along the way, and very strikingly described. Again, in the suttas, in the sutta it says, dark man with red eyes in a donkey cart with muddy wheels, armored with a quiver and wreathed with a yellow lotus, his hands, clothes and hair all wet. So it's a striking figure to meet, right? And you're going along. So in these kinds of stories, when we meet non-human or supernatural creatures, or beings, there is often a kind of it often kind of slides between depicting supernatural creatures and depicting tribal peoples, right? So you notice that here it says he's dark-skinned. And this, of course, would have been one of the issues when you're doing this kind of trade. You meet tribal peoples who probably have bows and arrows and who would probably be attacking or leading your caravan astray to take your stuff from you. And so the way that these things are described is often kind of straddles that boundary. Sorry, I'm not sure. There's someone using tools next door. Can you hear that on the thing? Are we doing okay for sound? You can't hear it. Okay, good. In Pali and Sanskrit, one of the normal words for human is manusa. And the yaka that's met here, yaka being like a kind of native spirit or something, is described as being amanusa, right? Inhuman, unhuman, non-human. But amanusa doesn't quite mean non-human in a purely biological sense, like we might take it. The root meaning of it is from Manu, who was the first man. And manusa literally means like a follower of Manu or descendant of Manu. So in one way, what it really means is somebody who comes from the Aryan or the Vedic culture. right? So that's the kind of a root meaning of it. I mean, yes, it's applied more generally to mean humanity more generally, right? But amanusa can also be read in the kind of a way as being somebody who's outside the fold, outside of what we might call civilization, who speaks a different kind of language, has different customs, and so on. And so this kind of sutta is kind of, or this kind of story is kind of treading that line of, is it an actual supernatural creature, or is this a metaphor for the struggles they had and conflicts between tribal peoples or local inhabitants and the trade routes that were, of course, from the from the tribal people's point of view, these trade routes were invading their country, right? I mean, they saw that these people were just crossing their lands without any permission, and they were just defending their sovereignty, right? So that's their point of view. So this is something that you find a lot in stories about ancient India, and a lot of the times that there's coded ways of talking about the different people who are around about at the time. The red eyes is also an interesting different. I mean, obviously it kind of betrays that he's a supernatural person, but I wonder if it also means that he was high. Like, people used to take drugs to go to war and stuff, right? So you used to take, like, ephedra or some kind of stimulant or something like that. Not really sure. But anyway, okay. So let us, I'm just checking if there's any questions. We got so here, yeah. So let us proceed now to the Jataka story itself. Now, the links for the Jataka story I've given to Venerable Ananda Jyoti's excellent site on ancient Buddhist texts, which Ananda Jyoti is a good friend of mine, and he's a really amazing scholar who's just quietly done a huge range of really excellent quality work. And in the last few years, he's been doing a lot of work on the Jātakas. So one of the things that he's done is to produce a cleaned up and tidied up version of the old Jātaka translations, which is what we're going to be looking at in a minute. He hasn't really revised the translations that much. He's just tidied them up a little bit. But he's also done work on, like, new translations of unpublished parts of the Jātakas, line-by-line translations, and various other things. So if you have a look around his site, you can see quite a lot of resources for the Jātakas generally. All right. So now let us go to read the Jātaka itself. I'm going to try once more and see if I can share my correct tab. I won't read through the whole story of the present in detail, but just summarize it briefly. So this is taught by the Buddha in Savatthi. And about Anathapindika's friends. Anathapindika, one of the great donors of Sangha. And basically he brought 500 disciples of his along to the monastery, and they all had great faith. But then when the Buddha left, they fell away, and they stopped coming to the monastery and went over to follow other religions as well. So this is already telling us something, right? So this is telling us that we're in an age where we're telling a story about rich people. We're telling a story about where conversion of large numbers of people is one of our major concerns. This is kind of, I think, is also kind of interesting that we're beginning not with a story of liberation or something like that. We're telling a story about rich people making offerings. But let's move down the page a bit, Rob. If you can scroll down a bit, thanks. Keep going. Okay, to about there. Great. Then the next part of the background story, the Buddha is basically giving some of the reasons why that they should follow the Buddha, and about the excellent qualities of the Buddha, and so on. And so what the text is doing is it's taking the opportunity to teach some of the basic groundings in the faith and generosity of the Dhamma. So you can think about this in a way as being kind of a curriculum. like it's a starting text. So if you're going to be learning, so within the Buddhist community and within the Sangha community, not everybody studied everything. Typically, you'd go to a monastery where you'd study like one particular text. Like somebody might study the Majjhima Nikaya, somebody might study the Dhammapada, somebody might study the Jātakas. And so what they did is they tried to include the major teachings within that. So the commentary is sort of giving a summary of some of the foundational teachings that any student should have to know. We can scroll down again, Rob. Thank you. Keep going, keep going. Keep going, keep going, keep going, stop. Yeah. So then the Buddha says, okay, now I'll teach a story of the past, which is going to illustrate how foolish it is if you ignore good advice and then follow bad advice instead. And we come to the Jataka properly, which is in the blue text. And this is the story of the past. So I'll read this story. I'm not sure, I might skip over some bits because it's mostly similar to the one we've already read. In the past, in Benares, in the Kasi kingdom, there was a king called Brahmadatta. So this is a standard setting for many of the Jātakas, just as in the suttas. At Savatthi, the Buddha staying at Savatthi was the standard setting. Same thing in the Jātakas, it's Brahmadatta staying in Benares in the Kasi kingdom. And the fact that the king is named Brahmadatta is significant because it's identifying this as a Vedic kingdom. Right? So this is a kingdom within the realm of the Vedic or Aryan culture. At that time, the Bodhisattva took rebirth in a family of caravan merchants. After exiting from his mother's womb after 10 months and by maturing, he traveled around as a caravan merchant with 500 carts, going sometimes from east to west and sometimes from west to east. In Benares, there was another caravan merchant's son who was a fool, incompetent, who lacked skillful ways. Then the Bodhisattva, after taking valuable wares from Benares, filling the 500 carts, set them up ready for the journey. The foolish caravan merchant's son, also filling up the 500 carts, set them up for the journey. Kind of interesting that the setting has been changed a bit from the version in the suttas. So in the suttas, it doesn't identify the two different leaders, nor does it say one is smart and one is foolish, and they actually have the same caravan, which they later split up. We only find out later that one is foolish. So the Jataka story is making the moral more obvious from the beginning. Then the Bodhisattva thought, if this foolish caravan merchant's son goes together with me and the 1,000 carts travel along the same path, the path will not be able to bear it. The water and food for the people and grass for the oxen will be difficult to find, and either he or I have to go first. So he told him, the two of us can't travel together. Should you go first or come later? The foolish caravan merchant thought, if I go ahead, there will be many advantages. I'll go along a path that is not broken up. The oxen will eat untouched grass. The men will have curry leaves that are untouched. There will be clear water. I'll be able to fix the price as I like and sell my wares. And so he said, my dear, I will go first. So this is kind of interesting as an early, kind of an early insight into how capitalism works. Right? So you can see he's got this business plan that he imagines is going to really work for him, right? And he's looking for his profitability, his markup, and so on. Then the Bodhisattva saw many advantages of going on the journey later. This is called the second mover advantage, right? Still very much a thing in business circles, right? Wait till somebody else puts the technology out first. They can work out all the bugs and all of that stuff, and then you can come along second and the path has been smoothed for you. Those traveling along the path will make the rough places smooth. I'll go along the path that's been well traveled. The oxen of those going first will chew off the hard old grass, but my oxen will eat the fresh grass that springs up. In that place where the old leaves have been taken, my men will find fresh curry leaves. And having dug a well in the places where there's no water, they'll find water. Where they have dug wells, we can drink the water. Fixing the price is like depriving people of life. Coming along later, I will sell my wares at the price already fixed. Yeah. So you can kind of see it's interesting that there's these kind of rationalizations, these kind of market practical rationalizations that they're using for how they're going to be proceeding. So they all agree the foolish one's going to go first. Anyone who's considering making a startup, then you're getting a lot of good advice from here. Okay, very well. And he departed, he went beyond human habitations and reached the outskirts of the wilderness, which, as we've seen, probably is the Thar Desert in modern Rajasthan. We're going to skip over the next bit, just a bit of a digression on different kinds of wilderness, and get to the point. It says, therefore, the foolish caravan merchant, having placed very large pots on his carts and filled them with water, set out across the 60-league wilderness. When he reached the center of the wilderness, the Jātaka who lived there thought, I will make these men throw away the water they're carrying, and when they are weakened, I will eat them all. Not messing about, this Jātaka. Interesting that it kind of mentions here that the Jātaka who lived there. So the Yakas, in my translation, I usually translate Jātaka as being native spirit. Often in kind of modern Buddhist culture, Yakas are like this. This is like one of the ur texts that have created the impression of what Yakas are, that they are ogres who lurk in the wilderness and devour passing travelers and so on. Whereas actually in ancient India, Yakas were a much more ambiguous kind of creature. In Mathura, around a similar period of time, we find statues to Yakas and Yakshinis, which are very beautiful and powerful and elegant, and clearly not images of, cannibalistic ogres. So Yakas are diverse. That's all I'm going to say. So generally speaking, a Jātaka is simply a kind of native spirit or indigenous being or creature. So he made a delightful vehicle yoked by 2 all-white oxen, surrounded by 10 or 12 amanusas, non-humans, who had swords, shields, bows, and quivers in their hands, ornamented with water lilies and lotuses, with wet hair and wet clothes. Like a mighty lord sitting right there in his vehicle, which had wheels smeared with mud, he came along the path. So you can see that this shares a lot in common with the Sutta version, but quite a bit elaborated from it. Surrounded by amanusas before and behind, they went along with wet hair and wet clothes, ornamented with water lilies and lotuses, taking bunches of various lotuses, chewing on lotus stalks. They proceeded, dripping with mud and dripping with water. I mean, it's it's fairly obvious, right? I mean, they're really wanting you to think we have just come from a wet place, right? And they are conveying this to you as strongly as they can. And it seems like humans have always been susceptible to this kind of con, right? Anyway, so then an interesting remark here, that when the wind blows from the front, the caravan leader goes at the back, and when the wind blows from the back, the caravan leader goes at the front. Kind of interesting. And in this case, when the wind blows from the fore, they go at the front. Oh, right. So they evade the dust. Oh, I see. Yeah. So if the wind is coming at the head of the caravan, you don't want all the dust kicked up by the oxen, so you go at the front. But if the wind's coming from the back, you go at the back, right? So in this case, the wind was from the front. Therefore, the caravan merchant's son went along at the front. Kiyaka, seeing him going, asked him, and the caravan merchant also made his own vehicle descend from the path and gave way. And they talked, and we can scroll down a little bit. Thank you. Okay. The Yaka said, it's well known that starting from the line of trees in the dark forest, the whole forest is full of water, and the Deva constantly rains down. The valleys are full of water, and right there in that place, there are lakes covered over with lotuses. I mean, okay, just like a bit of moderation here might have been nice, right? He could have simply said, oh, there's a watering hole up ahead or something like that. So, also a good sign, and how to note when somebody's promising you too much. Yeah, when somebody, that's likely to be a con. A lot of good business advice in this one. What are you carrying here? Oh, such and such wares from the country. Oh, what wares in this one? And the cart that goes along at the rear seems to be weighed down. What's in there? Well, there's water. Oh, well, you did well to bring water from afar, but from here, there's no need. Just throw it away and you'll be fine. So then he went back to his own Yaka city. All right, interesting. Yakas have cities. Who knew, right? Then that foolish caravan merchant, because of his folly, accepted the Yaka's word, broke his pots, threw away the rest. Every last handful of water seems a little bit imprudent. Then they went forward. As the sun was going down, they unyoked the carts, placed them in a circle, binding the oxen to the wheels. For the oxen there was no water, neither could the men make rice gruel, and the weakened men lay right down there and fell asleep. Kind of interesting that they arranged the carts in that perimeter, right, like a wagon circle we're familiar with from Westerns and so on. And so that was like a basic unit of sort of organization. So later that night, the Yakas, having left their Yaka city, fell upon and cut off the life of all those men and oxen, ate their flesh, and went back, leaving just the bones. Not good, right? Anyway, Bodhisattva a month and a half later set out. Then with all the water, then he said to the leader said to his men, without asking me first, let no one use even a handful of water. In this wilderness, there are poisonous trees. Amongst you, let no one even eat a leaf, a flower, or fruit, which has not been eaten before, without asking me first. Okay, so a good leader looking after, caring for the safety and well-being of those under his responsibility. Having advised his men in this way, they entered the wilderness with their 500 carts. They got to the center of the wilderness. The Yaka, just like earlier, showed himself to the Bodhisattva's path. And the Bodhisattva said, in this wilderness, there is no water. It's known that. This fearless person with red eyes, whose shadow cannot be discerned, without a doubt persuaded the foolish caravan leader who went in front to throw away all his water, and when his company were weary, he will have eaten them. But he doesn't think about or know my wisdom and skillful ways. Therefore he said to him, you should go away. We are tradesmen, and without seeing water, we do not throw away the water we have. Having seen such a place, we will throw it away and will proceed after lightening our carts. All right, so a wise and discerning person does not listen. It's honestly hard to read through this without thinking of many parallels to the world today, which I'm sure many of you can also imagine in your different circumstances, that we are also faced with good advice, prudent advice, and we're also faced with people telling us, nah, just throw everything away, trust us. Yeah, I know I have red eyes and I've got weapons and I don't cast a shadow, but still you should trust me anyway. And it seems to be a message that is still all too persuasive. Then the Bodhisattva then heard his men talking about it. He persuaded them not to listen to that advice. And if we can scroll down a little bit further. He asked his men, how far does a shower storm blow? At least a league, but has anyone felt a shower storm on their bodies? How far can the top of a cloud be discerned? Can you see a cloud? No, master. How far can you see lightning? 4 or 5 leagues. Has anyone seen the lightning flash? How far can thunder be heard? 1 or 2 leagues. Has anyone heard the thunder? No, master. So again, really interesting that when he hears this dissension in his people, that he doesn't just order them, he doesn't just give a command, but he persuades them. And he uses evidence, points out logic, and then shows them the reality of the situation, specifically the weather, right? Specifically the weather. And he's telling them that we can see what our future is by understanding the weather. And we're going to be looking, one of the Jātakas we're going to be looking at in a couple of weeks gives also a nice parable for that, and a nice parable for climate change in particular. Okay, moving along. Okay, so he kept his people guarded, skipping down a couple of paragraphs here. had the oxen laid down in the middle of the man. With the leaders of his force, he took up the guard through the 3 watches of the night with sword in hand and stood waiting for the dawn. But on the following morning, having completed everything that needed to be done, he fed his oxen, discarded the weak carts, took the strong ones, discarded the wares of little worth and mounted the wares of great worth, and went on to his intended destination and sold his wares at 2 or 3 times their base value, and then took his whole company back to his own city. So again, this is a kind of a nice, interesting little detail, because that's not mentioned in the original story in the Digha Nikaya. If you recall, the Digha Nikaya version just said that they reached their destination safely. Right now, we're not just concerned with safety, we are also concerned with profitability. And if you are prudent, you also get to sell your wares at 2 or 3 times the base price and make a killing. So kind of interesting that that shift is happening here, right? So these Jātakas are giving you these kind of worldly wisdom advice, as well as, as well as Dhamma advice. It's like, how do you, be prudent and practice Dhamma and turn a profit at the same time? So you can see how this this kind of storytelling kind of evolved in that way as to be very, very popular and very persuasive kind of literature. All right. Then the brief conclusion, then the Buddha, we're now coming back to the present in the Buddha's day. Thus, household are those who grasped at foolishness came to utter destruction, but those who took hold of what is unquestionable, that is to say, what is unfailing or a winning hand, escaped from the hands of the inhumans, went back to the places they'd hoped for in safety, and returned once to their own abodes. Okay. Then the Buddha then speaks the verse. And this is actually unusual. Normally, the verse occurs inside the story of the past, right? So the highlight of the story of the past is usually the verse. But in this case, the story of the past is finished, and we now have the verse tacked on at the end, attributed to the Buddha. Apannakang tanang eke dutiyang ahutakika. Some have an unquestionable basis, while the foolish speak of another way. The intelligent understanding it should take hold of the unquestionable. And as I mentioned earlier, unquestionable should be translated something like a winning hand or an unfailing basis, something like that. Okay, then the commentary goes on to give further doctrinal explanation. Well, what is this unfailing basis? And then it gives a number of the standard Dhamma teachings, again, providing something of a syllabus for students. If we can scroll down and keep on scrolling down, keep going. So there's quite a bit here in terms of like summarizing a lot of the basic Dhamma teachings. Keep going. Keep going. There we go. So just to the last paragraph here, the teacher delivered and presented this Dhamma teaching, having told the 2 stories, he joined them together and showed the connection of the Jataka. At that time, Devadatta was the foolish caravan leader. His followers were Devadatta's followers, and the followers of the wise caravan leader were the Buddha's followers, and I indeed was that wise caravan leader. And so he concluded the teaching. So this is the classical way in which the Jātakas are always ended up by making an identification between the characters in the story and the people in the present life at the time of the Buddha. And again, you'll notice that in the Digha Nikaya version, this is not done. So there's no identification of the characters with the Buddha. Generally speaking, the Buddha always is identified with the main hero of the story, and the other members of the Sangha and so on are other good characters, while Devadatta and his followers are usually the bad characters. So this is a way in which these stories are kind of normalized and brought within the Buddhist tradition. Okay, so this is the Jataka. Rob, you can stop screen sharing if you like. So this is the Aparnaka Jataka. And we've looked this morning a bit at the historical background. We've looked a bit at the textual structure. We've looked at the verse. We've looked at the story from the suttas, which has inspired this. We've discussed a bit the economic and political background and the geography. And we've looked at the story as told and related in the commentary. So obviously, as the first Jataka, then there's quite an elaborate sort of cladding to it. Some of the other Jatakas are much more pared down. But one final detail I'd just like to mention is it's noteworthy from the manner of the commentaries discussion that this wasn't meant to be like a teaching for children. Like these are obviously, he's giving quite a lot of like, monastic training and so on. And so this is clearly meant to be a teaching that was studied in the Sangha and by the Sangha. So sometimes it's sort of said, oh, Jātakas is for lay people, something, something, something. I don't think this is really true. And I don't think that division ever really applied in the Buddha's teachings. Like you find, the Buddha teaching all different kinds of people. I don't think there's like a, generally speaking, that kind of division. So the Sangha was certainly studying the Jātakas. All right. So we've got 10 minutes or so left, so I just wanted to open up for some questions. If anybody had any questions or observation and so on before we wrap up for this evening.
Bhante, maybe in case there's people that don't know who he is, do you want to just give a short explanation who Devadatta was?
Who Devadatta was? Yeah, sure. So is there anyone who doesn't know who Devadatta is? No? A few people. Archana, good. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so Devadatta is the bad guy. He's the Buddha's cousin, usually said to be cousin. And he he joined the Sangha and had initial progress in his meditation, but became consumed with conceit and jealousy. And so he teamed up with the corruptible king at the time, King Ajatasattu, and tried to take over the Sangha. And so he proposed to the Buddha, why don't you just retire and I'll be the Buddha and I'll run things from now on. And the Buddha's like, no, thank you. And so Devadatta did a few things to try to do this. His first kind of move was to pretend to be very ascetic. So he sort of made 5 rules that he said, okay, let's keep all these 5 rules. Like you not have to, you can't sleep in a hut, you have to sleep outdoors. And so 5 rules like this. And he tried to persuade people by convincing them that he's very ascetic. So the Buddha rejected all of these things because he wanted to keep the middle way. But Devadatta was not really sincere in this anyway. And eventually, according to the story, Devadatta tried to kill the Buddha and that failed. And so, so Devadatta and his followers are the kind of the archetypal bad guys, the Buddha's nemesis in the story of the Buddha. And according to the Jātakas, that goes back a long way. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about that because, like, you always have that situations where there are people in your life who you don't get along with, right? And it sometimes seems hard to resolve these things, and they go on for a long time. And so, from a Buddhist point of view, it can be a long time, like like a very, very long time. But it's also true that in Buddhism that there is always a possibility for redemption. So the Buddhist tradition always maintains that in the future life that Devadatta will become enlightened. So he'll get there. It'll just take him a while, that's all. Okay, so Giordano asks, when were the Jātakas written, by who, and why? All right. So if we're talking about written, then they were written down sometime from about, so the Tripitaka was written down about 20 or 50 BC in Sri Lanka. and the Jātakas would have been written, the verses would have been written around that time, and the commentaries sometime later probably, or around similar time. If your question is when they were composed, they were, oh yeah, actually a good point. So because the Jātakas originate from a bunch of different sources, all right? So there's no kind of one date on them. Now, one of the things that Rhys Davids does in the article that I recommended to read is that he compares the Jātakas with the inscriptions in the stupas at Bharut and Sanchi. And in Bharut and Sanchi, you find depictions of these Jātaka stories that clearly show like quotes from the stories, episodes from them, and so on. And so it clearly shows that these Jātakas were present, that they were used in the Buddhist community at that time. And so they're dated maybe 2 centuries BC, or sometime after King Ashoka. So again, maybe like 300 years after the Buddha, something like that. So we know that the Jātakas, or at least some of the Jātakas, were current in the Buddhist tradition around that time. One of the interesting things, if you look at the setting of that Jataka, it says when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares. Now, from our point of view, that doesn't really mean anything. There was a city, there was in Kasi, Varanasi was there was a king, no big deal. But what we know from the politics of the time was that by the time of the Buddha, there was no king in Varanasi. Varanasi had been taken over by Kosala, and it was ruled by the Kosalan king. Afterwards, it was ruled by the Magadhan king. And so during this whole period, from the time of the Buddha for hundreds of years later, there was no king in Kasi. And so these are actually backdated to a social political situation which pertained a few hundred years before the Buddha. And many of the Jātakas, I believe, come from that time. So that is to say that the Jātaka stories come from many different periods of time, but many of them actually have very old roots, older than the Buddha himself. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case with this particular sutta, because this one is talking about those trade routes to the west, which to me dates it a little bit later than the Buddha. So I'm thinking the story is probably like 100 or 200 years after the Buddha. And, you know, you can see from the way that the story is depicted that it's at a time when the trade routes are not really well established. Like, people thought this is a really dangerous thing to do, right? If there was a normal big trade route, it wouldn't have been a big deal, and you wouldn't be telling these kinds of stories. And we know that that was in fact the case not long after, because Alexander established the trade routes, and there was a massive trade between India and the West starting from a few hundred years later. So it situates it in that period, to my mind, this particular story, maybe 200 years after the Buddha or something like that, give or take a century or two. Well, a lot of the other stories are actually going to be quite older. And I think we'll be looking at one such story, I think, next week, which I believe has much more ancient roots. So some of the stories, the roots of the stories may be pre-Buddhist, but the form in which we have them today dates from maybe between 200 to 300 years after the Buddha, generally speaking. But of course, the commentary was finalized nearly 1,000 years after the Buddha. About 900 years after the Buddha was when the commentary was finalized. So they could have been changed at any point up to then. So yeah, it's a complicated question. So who were the Jātakas written? When were the Jātakas written? By who? I think the stories originated probably in the folk storytelling tradition for the most part. Some of them may have been told by the Buddha. Like I said, there's a few instances of Jātakas told in the suttas or by disciples of the Buddha. Many of them were collected, and we don't really know who they were done. Probably best to just think of them as being collected by the Sangha in that period of time. And why? Why the main sort of cultural shift that was happening was that Buddhism was shifting from being a specialized, fairly esoteric philosophy with some broad-based appeal, but mostly more about meditation, renunciation, and so on, to being a fully popular religion. And that shift happened especially in the time of King Ashoka, when he embraced Buddhism and it became a religion of devotion. people were visiting the Bodhi tree, and they were starting to do things like making Buddha images and so on. That came a little bit later, but it was starting to become a devotional religion. And so Buddhism needed ways of connecting and communicating to people that weren't so doctrine heavy as you find in the suttas. And so this is why I think that they were using that storytelling technique. Yeah. Okay, good. Rob, I think we're about at time.